It was the spring of 1942, somewhere on the gravel flats south of Tobruk, and a Royal Army Ordnance Corps fitter whose name history never recorded was doing something that would have horrified any officer trained at Sandhurst. He was bolting a captured German 8.8 cm Flak 36, the dreaded 88, onto the chassis of a 30 hundredweight Morris commercial lorry, using whatever steel plate, railway sleepers, and sheer bloody-mindedness the workshop had to hand. No blueprint existed for this. No factory in Birmingham had stamped out a single bracket for it. By every rule of conventional soldiering, the thing should have collapsed under recoil on its first shot, shaken itself to pieces on rough ground, or toppled the lorry over entirely. It didn't. It fired. Over the following 18 months, these improvised gun trucks, built in desert workshops from wrecked vehicles and battlefield salvage, became some of the most feared weapons facing the Afrika Korps' Panzer crews, who had grown used to being the ones doing the terrifying. This wasn't a triumph of engineering, it was a triumph of understanding exactly what the Desert War actually demanded, whilst the manuals were still describing a war that didn't exist anymore. Standard artillery doctrine in 1941 was unambiguous. Anti-tank and heavy guns belonged on purpose-built carriages, towed into position, dug in, camouflaged, and fired from a fixed emplacement. The British Army's own field manuals were explicit about this. A gun needed a stable platform to absorb recoil, a level firing surface, and time to lay and range properly. Mounting a heavy gun on a moving vehicle's chassis was, in the words of more than one staff officer who inspected early Q trucks in the Western Desert workshops, an engineering absurdity that invites disaster. The Germans, for their part, had perfected the towed 88 as a static killer. Originally designed by Krupp as an anti-aircraft gun, the Flak 36 fired a 9.4 kilogram shell at a muzzle velocity of roughly 820 meters per second, more than enough to punch through the frontal armor of any Allied tank in the desert at ranges beyond 1,800 meters. German gun crews could dig an 88 into a hull-down pit, camouflage it amongst scrub and rubble, and let British armor walk into a killing ground before a single shot was fired in reply. This was the gun that had broken Operation Battle Axe in June 1941 and had murdered British armored regiments at Sidi Ritzeg that November. Critics in the British chain of command argued, correctly, that the towed, dug-in 88 was one of the most effective anti-tank weapons of the war. They were also convinced that any attempt to put such a gun on a moving lorry chassis would sacrifice exactly the stability and accuracy that made it lethal in the first place. On paper, they had every reason to be right. What conventional thinking missed was that the Western Desert wasn't fought like Salisbury Plain, and the men actually doing the fighting, long-range patrols, armored car squadrons, and ad hoc jock columns improvised by Brigadier Jock Campbell, had already learned a harder truth. A gun that couldn't move was a gun that would be outflanked, bypassed, or abandoned when the line collapsed, which it frequently did across the featureless terrain between El Agela and Mersa Matruh. The secret was in treating the lorry not as a firing platform in the conventional sense, but as a delivery and escape system. Workshops run by Royal Army Ordnance Corps and Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, fitters in the 8th Army's back areas, stripped down captured Italian and German vehicles, salvaged knocked out gun carriages, and reinforced lorry chassis, typically the Morris Commercial CDSW or the larger Mack NR, with extra cross-bracing and steel decking to spread the shock of recoil across the frame, rather than concentrating it on one point. Sandbags and ballast were packed low to lower the center of gravity. Crucially, nobody expected these guns to fire repeatedly from the same spot. The doctrine that emerged, call it shoot and scoot, decades before the term became fashionable in tank circles, was to drive into range, fire 2 or 3 rounds, and move before German spotters or supporting panzers could range in a reply. What actually mattered wasn't a smooth, stable shot. It was getting one good shot off from an unexpected direction and being a quarter mile away by the time the enemy worked out where it had come from. A traveling gun mounted high on a lorry bed could also see over scrub and broken ground that would mask a towed gun sitting low to the earth, giving improvised gun trucks an observation advantage that pure stability could never buy. To understand why this worked, you have to understand what a Ford Ordnance workshop in the Western Desert actually had available, because it wasn't much. These weren't tidy depots with parts catalogs. They were open-air yards strung along the coast road, stocked with whatever could be dragged off a battlefield, burnt-out Italian Lancia lorries, German half-tracks with seized engines, and guns whose original carriages had been blown apart by the very fire that knocked out the crew serving them. The Flak 36 itself, once separated from its wrecked Sonderanhänger 202 trailer, was a remarkably self-contained unit, a 4.93-meter barrel, a semi-automatic sliding block breech, and a cruciform mounting that, crucially, didn't actually need the trailer underneath it to function. It needed a flat, rigid surface and something to bolt the trunnions to. That something was the chassis of a Morris commercial, or, where one could be scavenged, the heavier American-built Mack NR 10-ton lorry. Fitters cut away the cab roof, or rear bed, welded box-section steel reinforcement along the main chassis rails to stop the frame flexing under the gun's firing reaction, and built a simple firing platform from whatever materials were available. Recoil, rather than being fought, was managed. Ballast, sandbags, ammunition crates, sometimes broken engine blocks, was packed low and centered in the lorry bed, keeping the vehicle from rocking back on its springs hard enough to throw the gun's aim off after the first round. None of this matched factory tolerances. Welds were uneven. Paint was whatever camouflage color was already in the tin, but none of that mattered, because the alternative wasn't a better gun. It was no gun at all, towed uselessly behind a soft-skinned vehicle with no traction in soft sand. Crews who served these mountings, nicknamed simply the gun truck in unit slang, since official nomenclature never quite caught up, described firing from them as closer to handling a fast field gun than a heavy anti-aircraft piece. One gunner's account, recorded by a war correspondent traveling with the 8th Army's support group near Bir Hakeim, put the sequence simply. The driver brings her up, we drop the tailgate brace, lay on whatever's coming, fire twice if we're lucky, 3 times if we're mad, and the driver's already turning before the breech is closed on the last round. That instinctive urgency, entirely unlike the deliberate ranging fire of a dug-in German battery, was the whole tactical philosophy in a single breath. The clearest vindication came during the seesaw fighting around Knightsbridge and the Gazala line in late May and early June 1942. The 7th Armored Division, the original Desert Rats, their Jerboa emblem stitched onto every sleeve, had by this point absorbed several of these improvised 88-mounted lorries into their support groups, often crewed by gunners who had themselves been on the receiving end of German 88 fire at Sidi Rezeg 6 months earlier. German after-action reports from the 21st Panzer Division, recovered and translated by British intelligence officers after the battle, recorded confused assessments of enemy anti-tank fire originating from unexpected and shifting positions, inconsistent with known fixed emplacements. One captured Panzer officer, interrogated near Bir Hakeim in early June 1942, reportedly told his interrogators that his unit had assumed it faced multiple concealed gun pits, only to realize afterwards that a single mobile gun had fired from 3 separate positions within 20 minutes, appearing, striking, and vanishing into dead ground before counterfire could be organized. To Panzer crews, trained to expect the 88's threat from a fixed, identifiable point on the map, a heavy gun that moved like a tank but hit like an 88 was deeply disorientating. The 88 in any configuration remained capable of destroying a Crusader or Grant tank with a single round, at ranges British 2-pounder and even early 6-pounder guns could not match. What the mobile mountings added wasn't extra killing power per shot. The ballistics were identical to the towed version, but survivability and reach. Where a towed 88 emplacement, once spotted, could be flanked, shelled, or rushed by infantry, the gun trucks repeatedly broke contact and reappeared elsewhere along the line, forcing German commanders to commit reconnaissance and escort forces to hunt down guns that weren't where anyone expected them to be. A similar pattern emerged during the fighting retreat that followed Gazala in mid-June 1942, as the 8th Army withdrew towards Mersa Matruh and the El Alamein line. Rearguard actions are exactly the scenario-towed artillery handles worst. There's no time to dig in. And every minute spent in placing a gun is a minute the column isn't moving. It was here the gun trucks earned their keep. Operating in pairs attached to armored car regiments, such as the 11th Hussars, they could drop into a firing position on a low ridge, engage pursuing panzers at 1,500 to 2,000 meters, and withdraw under their own power rather than being abandoned, a fate that befell a number of towed guns that same retreat once their towing vehicles were knocked out. German war diaries from the pursuit note repeated frustration at well-aimed heavy fire from positions that could not be located before withdrawing, a complaint echoing the earlier reports from Bir Hakeim almost word for word. It's worth dwelling on how completely this inverted the assumptions both sides had walked into the desert with. German artillery doctrine, refined through years of peacetime development, treated the 88 as a precision instrument best served by patience. Range it accurately, let the enemy commit, and destroy him from a position he can't easily locate. That doctrine had worked devastatingly well at Halfaya Pass and Sidi Rezeg, where terrain and tempo gave German gunners the time their training assumed they'd have. What German planners hadn't accounted for was a British army that, having been bled badly by exactly that doctrine, responded not by building a better static gun position of its own, but by removing the assumption of stillness altogether. A workshop fitter doesn't think in terms of doctrine. He thinks in terms of what he has and what it needs to do. What he had was a wrecked gun and a serviceable lorry. What it needed to do was put a German tank-killing round somewhere a German tank crew wasn't expecting it from. Everything else, the welding, the bracing, the ballast, was simply the engineering required to make that idea survive contact with reality. Critics at GHQ Cairo, who inspected early gun trucks and pronounced them unsound, weren't wrong about the engineering. Judged as a stable firing platform, a lorry with an 88 welded to its bed was self-evidently inferior to a gun on its own trailer without riggers dug into firm ground. But they were judging the wrong thing. The Desert War wasn't going to be won by whichever side had the more structurally sound mounting. It was going to be won by whichever side put fire on target faster than the enemy could organize a reply. And on that measure, a vehicle in firing position within a minute, and gone within 5, beat a textbook emplacement that took the better part of an hour to dig in properly. This wasn't accidental, and it wasn't the product of any single brilliant design choice. Commanders in the desert weren't clinging to outdated towed gun doctrine because they didn't understand mobility. They understood, better than almost anyone else in the war, that the desert had no hedgerows, no walls, no terrain to hide behind. Movement itself was the only cover that existed. What looked unstable and amateurish on a workshop inspection sheet, a heavy naval-derived gun bolted to civilian lorry running gear with field-fabricated bracing, looked entirely different once it was driving at speed across open ground under fire, where a Panzer crew's stationary methodical approach to range finding became a liability rather than a strength. The deeper principle was one the Eighth Army had paid for in blood since 1941. In mobile desert warfare, a weapon's tactical value isn't fixed by its specifications on a Krupp datasheet. It's determined by how well it matches the rhythm of the battle being fought. The 88 on its proper Sonderanhänger 202 trailer was, without argument, a superior firing platform in laboratory terms, more stable, more accurate at extreme range. But laboratory terms assume time to dig in, time to range, and an enemy who stayed where you expected him. The Gazala battles offered none of those luxuries. Desert Rat fitters and gunners didn't out-engineer Krupp. They outthought a problem Krupp's engineers had never been asked to solve. What happens to a perfect gun when the ground underneath it refuses to stay still? British improvisation answered that with bolts, sandbags, and lorries dragged out of vehicle parks, and panzer crews who had once owned the desert's longest reach found themselves, for the first time, looking nervously over their shoulders at ground they thought they controlled. Battlefields aren't won by the side with the better datasheet. They're won by the side that understands, faster than the enemy, what the ground actually demands. And the desert rats, scavenging and welding under a merciless sun, understood that better than anyone wearing a staff officer's red tabs back at GHQ Cairo.